Nobody's talking about it. The story is you should hold back. You should hold back.
End of the civilized world. Is it true? Is it true? Well, take a look. You're building a culture to encourage international terrorism.
All the names have been changed. Hold back. Hold back. Nothing will hold up. All the names have been changed. Hold back. Nothing will hold us back. One by one, the names have been changed.
Welcome back to All Hell Can't Stop Us. I'm Jeff Cliff. This is a weekly podcast / vlog / record of the time, record of what's going on in the world around us, and hopefully a conversation with other people as I kind of go from week to week. And this week I do have a special guest, but I do want to briefly mention that if you are hearing this on Spotify, which apparently this podcast can be heard on, please do your best to disconnect and not give money to Spotify because of various reasons. But I will get into that at a later time. So are we still there, Saskboy?
Yes, I'm here.
I think you're still a little quiet. I'm just going to turn you up a bit. But excellent. Good to hear we still have you here. And hopefully the audience can hear as well. I'm just going to reposition our microphone a little bit. So, how have you been out there in Regina, Saskatchewan, Canada?
Somewhat frigid out here.
Is it still... It hasn't gotten like really, really cold over here in Saskatoon. Has it... is the weather like significantly different down there, or how's that going?
-7 and dingy. It hasn't produced very much solar power on my solar panels the last couple of days.
Oh, speaking of, so were you part of that rebate program that got cut?
Yes.
I can't remember if
I need
we...
to submit my rebate and get it. I'm one of the last people that will get that rebate, and then everybody else gets basically cheated out of having the opportunity because of the Sask Party government.
Hooray. I can't remember if we talked about that the last time you were on or not.
Probably briefly, because it was, well, if it hadn't happened at that point, it was about to. And the 16 megawatt limit, artificial limit that Power and the government had imposed was reached before schedule, which was anticipated maybe in 2021. And they said, well, we're going to just shut down the program. And then they did. And then all the solar installers are, wait a second, you can shut down the rebate of 20-ish%, but what about our ability to connect new customers? And they're like, oh, that really matters? I guess we'll come back and let you know what we'll do in a few weeks instead of a few months. And they're like, well, gee, I guess you really should tell us that you're going to shut down our businesses at a stroke of a pen, instead of doing what before happened, which was always to change the rebate to a lesser amount of money or to do something in that regard.
Yeah, a little bit more gradual sort of thing.
Yeah, the government came back a few weeks later and said, okay, we'll let you apply again to install people's systems, but there's no more 20% rebate, and instead of having a net metering system, we'll have a net billing system and still call it net metering to deceive people. And we're going to then only offer you 7.5 cents for every kilowatt hour that you send back to the grid instead of the full amount that you pay when you take a kilowatt hour. So it's not net metering because there's no net difference anymore in what you send versus what you take, which really hurts the payback time on the system and puts the province back maybe 8 years or more. But worse than that, it actually has killed the industry because companies have closed up shop in some cases. Some have moved out of the province already. And I don't know, almost 100 people have been laid off, as what the latest stat that I saw on the news was.
I'm definitely interested in that 100. So of those businesses, do you know of any of the ones that have like closed up or have been like directly impacted by them? So we can like get a little bit more kind of concrete examples of this, because I'd imagine you probably do, right?
Yeah, the company that installed my panels both times, Sound Solar, he's looking to wrap up his solar installing portion of his business.
Ouch. Oh, lovely. Especially during a period of time. It seems like we're heading into a recession right now. And there's a lot of industries, not just the renewable energy industry, like the oil industry, I think is still hurting. The potash industry just laid off a couple hundred workers. Like things are kind of looking a little dim here for them to be cutting a whole industry's legs from under them. But in the meanwhile, though, as far as your car share program, how is that going as far as with the solar energy and that sort of thing?
Well, that's going fairly well. There's some money that's been donated to us by Affinity Credit Union, and they're going to allow us to purchase electric vehicles for our fleet for the first time.
Okay.
And that'll be not the first car share fleet in the province with electric cars, but the first one in Regina. So people will soon be able to rent electric cars by becoming a car share member.
Awesome. And it's kind of interesting that is kind of brought up because I actually saw my first car share car that I can even ever remember seeing this past maybe week or so. And it was one of the Saskatoon ones, I think it was the electric one. But
yeah,
I think it was like
Sparks, I think.
Yeah, but it was like a BMW or some kind of like really, really ritzy
i3 it might be.
Yeah, it might be that. And like
the i8, which looks like a race car, and there's the i3, which looks like a sort of a stubby minivan, maybe.
Yeah, it was definitely that one. And like it was kind of interesting that being part of a car share program, you'd be able to have access to that fairly fancy car. And I mean, the car share program here isn't super cheap, but it's definitely would be cheaper than owning one of those cars for sure.
It's certainly more cheap than owning, and that's the major selling point, I think, for them, especially now that you can drive cars that you wouldn't actually otherwise have access to. So for someone looking for an impressively different and better car, then car share usually is the way to go, because you usually tend to get a newer car than you can afford yourself, because more people are paying for that equipment together.
Exactly. And so you mentioned that you're going to be getting some new cars, the electric cars. And I think you were also talking before we kind of connected here that there was some talk about kind of new plugs in the city, or how does that
end up needing places to charge them. So there's the Petro-Canada Electric Highway chargers that will likely be a place we can charge up at. And there's a possibility, of course, wherever we park the cars, there'll be a need for an electric car charger. So right now our parking spots are on Ray Street and at City Hall Parkade.
Okay.
So high probability that we'll work something out with the city to have an electric car charger in there.
Makes sense.
Maybe it'll be one available for the public too, depending on how things are structured.
It would definitely make sense to kind of bring people to that spot, right? If you had like a car or two, or a plug or two beside it, just kind of to get people to drive or be driven even kind of to the car share, so that they can kind of rent out the car, drive around for a bit, and then either get picked up or whatever. Just so
it's right near the bus. There's a bunch of bus stops that go right by there.
Oh, perfect.
And there's, because it's just 2 blocks from the downtown Cornwall, sort of intersected with 11th bus station outside. And there's other buses that go right by the library. That's just across the street from the parkade.
Nice. And I think you were talking a little bit about the Canadian Tire was talking about getting a plug as well.
Yeah, Canadian Tire in the east end of Regina has a Tesla supercharger site. It is not online yet, though. It all looks like it should be working. It's got the painted parking spaces, and it will be activated, I think, this month is what some people were suggesting, but it's really up to people who push the paper to decide. So. And
probably stuff like electrical certification, that making sure the electricians sign off on it. Did I ever tell you about the story of the laser cutter in the hackerspace in Thunder Bay at all?
I don't think so.
Oh, it's a bit of a funny story in that we finally got up the nerve. Like when I first moved to Thunder Bay, the hackerspace there had been talking about getting a laser cutter for quite a while and applying for government funding to get this laser cutter. And the way the organization was structured, there was like a board, and then above the board there was like another group that was technically in control of the bank account, but which the board paid no attention to whatsoever and was functionally a different organization. And so it was the board that wanted the laser cutter, not this kind of umbrella group. And here's me being a new person to the city, a new member, and they were looking for someone who was ballsy enough to basically they had already filled out the paperwork, but nobody wanted to put their name on it, basically saying, yes, I want a laser cutter from paid for by the federal government or whatever grant this was. And so I'm like, yeah, I'll put my name on that dotted line. And so I did. And then we submitted it. And the umbrella group caught word that we had applied for this big grant without getting their permission for it. And so somewhere along those lines, that plan was cut, and they called the government or whatever and said, no, please don't give us this money. We want it, but we don't want it, et cetera, et cetera. And, and so nothing happened for a while. And we were kind of short on funds for a while. And then we moved into the basement of the public library in Thunder Bay. And while we were there, the public library expressed support in funding, or helping to fund this same basically $50,000 laser cutter. So we got our funds together, their funds together, figured out how we would pay for it, figured out the business plan for it, sort of thing. All our ducks in a row that we thought we could. And then we sent out the $50,000 to get this laser cutter. And we investigated it. We found a cutter from China. We were thinking about getting the cheap ones from China, but we're like, no, we'll go with the ones in the States, because you never know with those sketchy Chinese companies. And maybe the American companies will be legitimate. And if something goes wrong, at least they'll be kind of closer. So our court systems will be more compatible, that sort of thing. And so we get this laser cutter. It arrives. Works like perfect right off the bat. It's a beautiful machine, well set up for what we needed it for, perfect size, worked with our plugs, our power plugs. It was just exactly what we needed. But the library, in the meanwhile, is an old building. It's a 100-year-old, or fairly old anyway, building. Still might have kind of like the cloth electrical system or knob and tube or whatever it was that they had, that in the background required them to get routine electrical inspections. And it just so happened that like the week after we got this laser cutter, but we got this like a week after we got the laser cutter, the freak inspection came, and the fire department or whoever it was took one look at it and said, oh, this isn't CE or CSA certified to be legally used in Canada. This piece of electrical equipment, you cannot legally plug it in. I mean, all it is just like a 3-prong plug connected to a 450 or 2,000 watt or whatever power supply, no different than any other computing device. It's the same thing, only nobody bothered to fill out the paperwork to get this thing approved in Canada, or at least in Ontario. And so we couldn't plug it in. And because we're in a public space, it's not like we could plug it in and not tell anyone, because we're like surrounded by glass. Everyone sees what we're doing in there, so it's not like we could get away with that. And so it just sort of sat until we could either A, get an electrician at $250 an hour to come and basically take one look at it and go, yeah, it's a 3-prong plug plugged into a 500 watt or 2,000 watt or whatever power supply that, I mean, it's got fans around it that keep it cool. It's not going to start on fire. It's a normal piece of electronic equipment, no different than anything else you've got plugged in here. And the crazy thing is, had we built it ourselves by plugging in just a regular 3-prong plug to a regular whatever power supply, which we had sitting on the shelves all around us, that would have been legal, because it would have been in our own concoction and we wouldn't have had to certify it then. But because we bought it, legally we had to certify it. So we wound up like sending it back to this company and then trying to get our money back from it, and went through a big long trail of paperwork for that. But the crazy thing is they had apparently done this to like 3 or 4 other entities in Canada and knew full well, or should have known, that it wasn't legal, and still sold it to us. And that was the kind of kicker. And of course, like all the while, we're getting offers from people going, yeah, like if you want to sell this to us for like $40,000, we'll use it, and we're not in the public, so nobody will care if we plug this into our power plug. But it's just funny sometimes how like the paperwork involved in such a thing gets like totally out of control in a hurry. So anyway, that was just like a small little story there. But
Yeah, I understand that perspective dealing with the city so far in our quest to get the electric car charger at their site.
so anything else
There's
new
some
with
paperwork.
the car share program other than the kind of new possible plugs and that sort of thing?
That's all I can think of at the moment. We had our AGM in late October, or rather early October. Let me think here. No, late October is when we had our AGM. And that went pretty well. We're in discussions with possibly hiring a student with some grant money that might help with a project to further car sharing in Canada and benefit the industry overall.
And would that be for like marketing, or what would that student's role kind of be?
Haven't determined the exact project yet, but marketing is one of the possible aspects. It could be to do with technological upgrades, various engineering projects, or computer science projects.
Oh, cool. All right, so that's kind of the one thing that has been kind of going on. The other thing, I kind of wanted to bring this up, and I'm sure you'll be able to chime in as well. And I just want to get the quote here on the screen, because it's not so often that you catch a politician in this kind of a lie, where like they're just so openly brazen about what they say that they're going to do and then do, and like the difference between the two. So I have a picture up here in front of me, and I'm sure you've seen this picture, but for those of you who have not, this is a picture of Jason Kenney in front of a podium with big words saying, quote, "Public Health Guarantee, United Conservatives," behind a big poster saying, "Public Health Guarantee, Jason Kenney, if elected, or a United Conservative government," and this is in Alberta, "will maintain or increase health spending, maintain a universally accessible, publicly funded healthcare system." And then the picture I have has a blank signature and date, but I have seen the picture where he actually signs this giant poster behind him, putting his reputation on the fact that he's going to increase or maintain health spending, because this was one of the things that, of course, the NDP could use against the Conservatives, and they knew it. They knew that they have a history of cutting healthcare related things, and that the people who did vote NDP but who were kind of on the fence in Alberta would freak out if he didn't promise that he would not cut healthcare funding. And then, of course, what do we get this week? But for Alberta Health Services cutting hundreds of nursing positions, UNA and NDP, 500 full-time equivalents over 3 years. One article says, we have the next article making a claim 7,000 public positions could be eliminated, 5,900 full-time positions, 2,000 to 3,000 general services. How many in healthcare here? I think the healthcare union is claiming 850 full-time positions and 1,000 employees. And then another article, the nursing union, so this is a separate union, is claiming 750 frontline positions are being cut. So all adding up together, we're seeing massive cuts and massive layoffs all over Alberta, and in particular the healthcare side of things, which is a consequence of not a maintained spending, but a decrease in spending. So I'm sure you're well aware of this, but how have you been hearing this news, and what's your take on it?
I've been watching this through Twitter mostly. I've been aware of Jason Kenney long before he was Premier of Alberta, or a candidate with a kamikaze candidate to help him get elected to the UCP leadership. He was a Harper minister for, I'd say, about a decade, I guess, from around 2006 to 2015. And the first time I saw him on some political program, he was telling a lie about something.
First time.
My opinion of him was not very high to begin with. He's seems to be driven by theology, in particular the type of Christianity that hates homosexual people. And he's spent some of his life preventing homosexual couples from being together in hospital while one is passing away from an illness. Mm-hmm. So just kind of a nasty person that really shouldn't be a premier of a province, and it's really unfortunate for Alberta that they're stuck with him unless they do something to, democratically or otherwise drive him out of office. He's going to be a major problem for their economy, I think, too, because he doesn't understand and isn't willing to adapt the province to be a no carbon economy. He was mocking the Tesla supercharger location in Fort Macleod a few years ago online, for example, because there were no cars visible at it. Well, it was like the middle of winter, the station had just been set up, and it's like a gas station where there aren't always cars at a gas station, but that doesn't mean you get rid of it and that nobody's using it or depending on it.
Also, doesn't that kind of say something about the leadership of the province when there's someone trying to build something, right? This is trying to like add jobs, trying to build infrastructure, investing in the province, and then they get mocked for it. It's kind of says something about the leadership there. And of course, you're right that he was a Harper crony, and that the entire time during the Harper reign, when Harper was kind of on a warpath through the various, I guess, things that he was doing wrong, we didn't hear so much as a peep from Kenny. Of course, so you can imagine his ideology is going to align pretty close with the Harper years and kind of what that meant. And so that's kind of worth pointing out on its own. And as far as the anti-gay side of things, I've been reading a book that it's called Fix Canada. Have you heard of this book at all?
No, I haven't.
It's basically like a conservative how-to guide focused around Alberta to try to basically make Alberta great again, that sort of thing. And I've seen it in gas stations and coffee shops all around the province, and I think even in Manitoba as well. But it's interesting to note like how tightly coupled the problem or the perceived problem of homosexuals being a bad thing and given too much leeway or whatever is in this particular book to the economic and other political questions of the day in this conservative worldview. And like, if you haven't, like, I wouldn't necessarily recommend going out and buying this book, but if you get a chance to just kind of skim through it, because like it starts with an attack on gay people and then continues, like every chapter kind of brings it back to that original point in that original chapter of like, and this is why things are going wrong in this country. And it's just bizarre to read because this is for sure how a lot of people are thinking right now. And when they're
what I've seen is in the former progressive conservatives in Canada were corrupted by the Reform Party, which morphed into the CRAP Party, the Canadian Reform Alliance Party, which then was quickly renamed into the Canadian Alliance Party, and then the Conservative Party of Canada. And now I just refer to them as the Conservative Party of Canada Racists Party, because I think the identity of that capital C conservatives in North America, whether it be the Republicans or the Canadian Conservatives, is one that centers on populism, which includes xenophobia, it includes racism of various sorts, climate change denialism, and misogyny. There's just so many aspects of undesirable social behaviors that are promoted by these right-wing parties.
right.
And they base their identity on those factors and not formerly on being socially conservative, like keeping things the way they are, or fiscally conservative, focusing on keeping the money system the way they are.
Yeah, it was especially interesting to note, like during the last election, because the PPC, at least to their credit, were more fiscally conservative than the Conservatives. When they tried to make the claim of being fiscally conservative, they really had some idea of how to do that. Whereas the regular conservative branch of the party didn't even kind of pretend to be fiscally conservative. It was just like, yeah, we're going to cut the taxes for the big banks and the wealthy and spend like crazy. It's pretty much...
It's not about being financially responsible, but they can still convince conservative voters that they're the party of fiscal responsibility, which is what Kenny, of course, would try to argue.
Yeah.
Even though Rachel Notley's economic woes in Alberta, which weren't even very significant, were not her doing for the most part. It was the undoing of the Conservatives in the last 40 years in Alberta by spending away their resource wealth that they could have saved like Norway did.
Exactly. And then the other thing on top of that, there was an interesting case while we were going door to door with the NDP, where there was a lot of people in Saskatoon, at least, and I'm sure the same is true in Regina, that have like drilled into their head that conservative equals PC, and that whenever they are going to go vote, they're going to vote for the PCs. Of course, there is a PC party in Canada, but it isn't the Conservative Party federally. But they still want to vote PCs, even though provincially the PCs have long since gone into obscurity and the Sask Party has kind of replaced them. But in their mind, it's still the PCs. And so when they expand it, it started, of course, as progressive conservative, but they're too lazy to kind of think of things through all the time, so it's been condensed to progressive. And so you have not just a couple of people, but quite a few people in Saskatoon who think they're voting progressive for the progressive option, which by that they mean PC, which by that they mean conservative, which by that they mean whatever the federal party just picked for them to vote for conservative candidate. But there was one particular case, one of the canvassers was speaking with it was like a husband-wife situation where the wife was saying basically they got into this interesting conversation with the wife, whatever. And the end of the conversation, the husband realizes who the wife is talking to. It's like, oh, we're not talking to leftists in this household. This household votes progressive. Door slam. It's like, nothing more, what was the quote? Nothing more progressive than telling your wife how to vote. But still, like this is the level of, I guess, political awareness here, where the ideal is voting progressive. But of course, progressive here means something completely different compared to the rest of the world. So that was kind of interesting.
I would say that any conversation about corrupt Alberta politicians is incomplete without talking about the open corruption in politics in Saskatchewan and how it really goes unsaid for the most part. The closest I've heard it mentioned in mainstream media in the last year was when Murray Mandrick on the CBC had a weekly political panel that they have with Stephanie Langenegger and I forget who they have with CBC as a guest as well. But it came up that the campaign finance rules in Saskatchewan are open for corruption because corporations and unions can donate to political parties. And Mandrick described it as a coincidence that bad things seem to happen in conjunction with this legalized dirty money.
Right.
And he's only willing to say coincidence and coyly toy at the notion that it's actually open corruption. Where we need columnists who people respect talking about politics, giving people the straight truth, which is it is tolerated legalized corruption that most other jurisdictions in the country have outlawed, and Alberta's looking to do an end run around their outlawing of it because it's the sort of money that corrupt parties like the UCP and the Sask Party need to maintain their strangleholds on power.
Exactly. And was it 2 years ago or 1 year ago that Progress Alberta did their expose on that? Do you remember?
I don't remember when
I think it was
but
2
I just
years
saw
ago.
Someone bring it up again today, and this past week they brought it up again about how easy it is to go through now online and find all of the corporations and public entities like the universities in the province and the cities and towns in the province like City of Regina giving money to the Sask Party and that usually for a dinner to send somebody to represent, which is in effect political donation.
Yeah, it is for sure. That's how they raise money. Like for those who are not aware of how this game works, there are plenty of examples in North America of politicians who, when they go to raise money, will host a big fancy dinner, and in order to get access to that dinner, you have to pay the $200, $400, $500, thousands of dollars per plate to get access to this dinner. Now, the food is probably reasonably good food at that particular dinner, but you're not paying for the food. You're paying to put money in the pockets of the particular politician you're going to see. In this case, that's the Sask Party, and it is just the way things are done here. But as you've kind of alluded to, like, this is not legal elsewhere in the world. This is a particular...
It's not even legal in Saskatchewan on a federal level.
Yeah.
They've outlawed that a long time ago. So, I mean, there's been... If you get that sort of money from a business, you, as a party, have to return it federally and say, sorry, we're not allowed to accept this money.
Right.
And you should know better. Don't do that. So this past week, I actually emailed a request to the Premier and to the Environment Minister that they should both resign for the economic good of the province because they're both unwilling or unable to do their jobs to safeguard our children's future and our economy to be compatible with a low-carbon economy that we know we must implement to meet our emissions targets in order to maybe keep the world livable.
Speaking of which, did you go to this Friday? It seemed like the kids were out on strike again. Is that going on in Regina at all?
It was going on. I was unfortunately at work. It was cold, and they had the environment minister actually attend this time. And there's a great photo online of 3 of the children organizers, Ada and Alex, and I can't remember the third one. And Alex, just from the angle of the photo, it looks like the minister's getting a very skeptical side eye. Which is what I would have been doing while listening to him, because he says he has a kid and is concerned about his child's future. But the way he behaves as a minister, it's hard to believe because of the way that he lets Saskpower get away with canceling our best renewable energy production in the province thus far. 16 megawatts is what they reached, or will soon reach when construction of the project's finished. And 2 years ago, Saskpower promised to do a 10 megawatt solar project on the utility scale, and it still hasn't been done.
Really?
So you can see that individuals like myself are actually producing more solar power than the public utility is producing.
Which that should be impossible.
Like not be happening, but then the minister is just kiboshed participation of companies that are making sure that the private individuals and companies are able to do at least as little as they are contributing. Now they're going to be able to contribute a lot less.
So on the note, as far as in Regina, though, like I noticed having gone to the strike, I can't remember, I think it was called like the March for Science or whatever, but the high school and elementary school kids leaving classes on Friday and promising to continue to do so until the actual action happens. Do you see the kids in Regina being so politically motivated? Like, I haven't seen anything like that, I don't think, in my life, of kids in such a cause actually coming out, even if it's a small number of them, even if it's only a couple hundred. Are they mobilized there, like, or is it just like a one-day thing, or is it like
what's ongoing for the last year at least? When Greta Thunberg's efforts in Sweden became known worldwide, there was definitely a Fridays for Future climate strike happening on Fridays here in Regina. They march from the Royal Saskatchewan Museum down to the legislature each Friday, and there's not always a large group. There's usually a group of 100 or more people. I know there were hundreds of people in maybe even over 1,000, I think, at the largest ones in September when the weather was nice. But this past one, it was on the news. I saw the news clip because the minister was speaking at it, and the kids had gained his attention finally, and he'd agreed to meet with them and hear their concerns. But I think from my perspective, it's not going to help because the minister is not willing to actually implement anything that will reduce emissions. He's been environment minister off and on since roughly 2009.
Wow.
And I was at an event in a hotel ballroom sort of situation where there was a environmental stakeholders, so the car share was invited as one, and the Sask Party government then set an emissions target of 20% below 2006 levels by 2020, which mirrored the federal conservatives' farcical claim that they were going to do the same. And,
and so how close have we hit to that? Exactly.
We're missing it. We're missing the
because we're like substantially up still, right?
Yeah, it climbs each year.
Yeah.
It's been down. It was down 1 year or 1 or 2 years, maybe sometime after there was the lull after the Great Recession of 2008.
Yeah.
And that's the only time that emissions have gone down. But it was just because of a change in the economy that they had no control over.
Anyway, we have 3 little comments from the peanut gallery over here. So we have, quote, Sask Party dropped the ball on the solar portfolio. Quote, teachers strike in 2000, question mark, and students protested. I'm guessing that means there was 2,000 students protested. I'm not sure exactly.
In the September one, there were in Saskatoon and in Regina, I would say that it was probably close to 2,000 people showed up altogether.
Interesting.
There was a lot of people in the September. There were 2 Fridays in a row. I went to both Fridays events that month.
And I also noticed in the event in Saskatoon this week that a lot of the kids were from one particular high school. think it was like Bethlehem School or something here in Saskatoon. And
Some of them have more supportive teachers than others, whereas like there was a child speaking at the Regina event last time I was there, and they said they had a teacher that was a climate change denier, and some others are afraid to speak out because the Regina Board of Education is not supportive. There was the scandal with the Regina Board of Education chairperson, Gagne. She was making what were deemed as maybe anti-homosexual comments. She's affiliated with a right-wing church that is probably homophobic from her comments then, and that was causing a stir among people here. They actually gathered a petition to call for a resignation.
interesting. And I'm imagining she's still in her post, still there, still helping to make policy.
Didn't heed that. There was an additional scandal because her church seemed to have been involved in trying to do a letter writing campaign against the school board and suggest that there should be less support for homosexual students.
Another comment from the Peanut Gallery here, quote, "If I recall, Catholic board denounced this," unquote. So do you remember if she was in the public or the Catholic stream?
Yeah, we're talking about the public school system, the Regina Board of Education. I don't know any details about the Catholic one.
All right. So, and then another link from the Peanut Gallery, "No free pass for Saskatoon students attending climate strike" from CBC, which class continues as usual, which I kind of was worried about, given the Sask Party's control over the Ministry of Education and being able to like push boards both here in Saskatoon and Regina to be kind of restrictive on students' ability to come out on Fridays. Like, I haven't heard anything kind of internal to that system, but if anyone has heard of anything like encouraging teachers to put tests on Friday or something like that, I'd love to hear it if this is actually happening. But one link I do want to get to before we get kind of too deep into things, other than that, is an American bit of news, a little bit of sad news kind of on topic here. Quote, "New York City is ending a ban on gay conversion therapy. Here's why." And they basically talk in this New York Times article about how the New York State understands that gay conversion therapy, if you can call it a therapy, basically an attempt to pressure and maltreat kids until they relent and pretend to be, basically it can go up to torture if it isn't entirely torture from start to finish. And they know it's wrong.
Religious-based schooling, I would classify it as torture from the get-go based on my experience with catechism.
How so on the catechism side?
That's maybe too tongue-in-cheek, and I don't mean to trivialize the actual torture that goes on, but I just found it unbearable to listen to religious preachings and not from an intellectual standpoint. Like a religious studies class that I took in university was fine because it was learning about a variety of religions and differences and similarities, versus a single religion saying this is how things are.
And I do suspect that in the long term, when we look back on this century and the last one, and all the time that kids spent basically repeating things that have basically no meaning, or spent in the parts of indoctrination, not necessarily all indoctrination, not necessarily all religious practices, not necessarily any single religion, but basically the parts of religion and other things that are religious-like, where they're basically forced to be bored, to shut down the inquisitive and playful part of their mind, and not to be serious because they have to be, but because it's just tradition to do so, right? The parts of church that are, you just sort of sit down, shut up, and not really even pay attention to anything, just like nod your head and go, okay, yeah. And am I understanding that catechism kind of falls in that category, or is it something a little bit different?
Well, for some people it would be like that. Others it might be more interactive, where people who are eager to fit in and have others there that they want to impress, maybe for friendship or romantic reasons, that they might participate in that activity more and try to be enthusiastic about it. But it wasn't something that I was ever interested in, and I didn't have anybody I wanted to impress, so I never really made an effort to participate, and I made an effort to get out of participating. Whereas in school, I was always keen to learn and participate.
Mm-hmm. So, in any case, continuing on this article here, the reason why they're stopping the ban and that they're allowing the gay conversion therapy to continue to take place in New York is because now that enough Supreme Court justices have been appointed by the Trump administration in the States, they don't want the case to hit the Supreme Court, because as soon as they ban it, there's going to be a lawsuit about it. And the lawsuit's going to be appealed, and it's going to be appealed to the district and the circuit court. And they've lost the circuit court to the anti-homosexual conservatives, and they've lost, at least in their mind, the Supreme Court to this blind bias against homosexual people and homosexual children. And they're worried that it won't be an impartial court and that it will rule against them on political grounds. And it's interesting to note that they're just afraid of even taking it to that point, that the legitimacy of law in the United States, it's like seen to be, you can do, or you can outlaw pretty much anything except for that one thing. The one thing that's core to the conservative worldview, that is the idea that you can't trust children to love, right? That you can't trust children to know who they're attracted to, etc. So,
well, yeah, their parents should decide that, obviously.
Clearly, it's like the oh man. No,
there's that reminds me of I saw conservatives discussing among themselves on Twitter about how Andrew Scheer is such a family man because he puts his kids to bed at 9:30 or so.
Yeah.
When he wanted to escape from reporters, he said, "I'm sorry, I got to go tuck the kids in." Nothing wrong with that. But I don't see Scheer as a family man. I see him as someone who would disown his own kid if they came out as not being straight.
Exactly. And certainly, if not him, enough people in that big tent, right? This is not an idle thing that we can detect when people are allowing the torture of children, because they know that it's going to be permitted if it gets to the point where the precedent-setting case comes to the Supreme Court right now. And
this was why the Regina Public Education Board rejecting the support for homosexual students was so offensive to many people, straight, gay, and allies of LGBTQ, because now it should go without saying that we want to be more supportive, because we know that LGBTQ youth are at higher risk of being attacked for who they are and being discriminated against, and to not support them with a open declaration of support is, I think, an open attack.
And certainly in the context of Saskatchewan and Alberta specifically, where we really do have a government that is hostile to them. And it is kind of worth keeping that in mind as discussions kind of go forward. In the meanwhile, we are kind of getting close to the end of the show here. So is there any last thoughts that you want to kind of get through to the world now that I have you on the microphone?
Oh, there's so many things, but I can't think of anything now off the top of my head after rambling for an hour.
No problem. I'm sure you'll be back on this show at some point. So
excellent. Look forward to it.
Awesome. So, and for those of you who are interested, definitely, if you're in Regina and haven't checked out the car share program, please do check it out. It is one of the better ways to get around town. And if you're interested in more shows like this, definitely give my Subscriber Star a check. Subscriberstar.com/Jeff-Cliff will get you there. And other than that, I will leave you all for the next week. And hopefully you enjoyed the show. I'll see you later. Oh, actually very important. I will play the goodbye song before I forget. Let me get that queued up, and here we go.
But in the meanwhile, always remember to be good, and so... Goodbye now. Goodbye now. I thought the party was the time. I spent the evening forgetting the time. I can't deny. Oh, now goodbye. Goodbye now. Goodbye now. The trip by taxi wasn't far. We lingered longer to find out how. No use to cry. And now goodbye. There's one advantage to all reasons.
I know.